Good evening. Before we look at some scriptures, we'd like to sing a song together and encourage our hearts to keep believing in God more and more. I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. My heart has no desire to stay where doubts arise and fears dismay. Though some may dwell where these abound, my prayer, my aim is higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's tableland, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. I want to live above the world, though Satan's darts at me are hurled. For faith has caught the joyful sound, the song of saints on higher ground. I want to scale the utmost height and catch a gleam of glory bright, but still I'll pray till heaven I found. Lord, lead me on to higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's tableland, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's tableland, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Well, praise the Lord. That is a desire. It's a very necessary thing for all of us as we deal with our life situations, both personally and universally, we find ourselves going through. I'd like to look at a little short psalm for a moment, if the Lord will help us, Psalm 93, and consider some things that could be pertinent to us because our situation parallels that of the faithful remnant of Israel who suffered during the exile and then emerged from that exile with faith to continue on the kingdom of God during a transitional time period of several centuries, finally culminating in the coming of the Messiah to this world. Here in Psalm 93, it starts off with a bold declaration, "The Lord reigneth." Now on the surface, that might seem rather obvious, but when you consider the plight that the psalmist was dealing with, his life, what he'd been through, and also the faithful remnant of Israel, the Babylonian captivity, finally coming back from that, and finding themselves with an opportunity to continue on in the Old Covenant faith, howbeit not as a great theocracy where they were triumphing in the eyes of themselves and the eyes of other human beings, but rather they were there to walk in the righteousness of the law as best they could. And they had come through quite a time when it looked like all of the things that were true and real were perhaps not true and real. But the prophets had laid a tremendous foundation prior to the judgment against Israel in 722 and Judah in 586 BC that prepared the hearts of people of faith. It caused them to understand what God was doing, even if they didn't see the finality of it. They knew that God was still on the throne, even though to the casual observer and to the nations of the earth in general, it might have looked like that the Lord Yahweh was just another God amongst all the other idols, and that he had been defeated by the gods of Babylon. So for this statement to be made, the Lord reigneth, is very significant. It shows the confession of faith and a heart of faith that the psalmist had. This phrase, the Lord reigneth, is only used a few times in the Old Testament. I believe it's about 5 times or so that it's used, and it's located mainly starting at Psalm 93 up through Psalm 99 verse 1. But we want to look at the 93rd Psalm and continue on with this thought here. The other perhaps can be considered at another time. So the Lord reigneth, and they saw God for who he was. He is clothed with majesty, he is clothed with strength, and he's actually girded with strength. In other words, faith could see that God wasn't weak. Faith could see that God was in charge of the world. You and I need to be reminded of that continually now with what we are seeing unfolding before our eyes. And it might look like that things are completely going out of control, and they may very well go out of control even further as far as man's control is concerned. But it was never out from under God's control in the time of the exile, and it's not out from under God's control now. He is still reigning. Yes. And it says, the world also is established that it cannot be moved. And then it goes on with a further thought, thy throne is established of old. That word of old actually in the Hebrew means from then, or from some point in the past. And it relates back perhaps to the phrase at the end of verse 1, when the world was established, his throne was also established, and there was no way that his throne could ever be contested. His power could ever be taken away. It's established of old, and then this bold declaration, thou art from everlasting. The word everlasting means as far back as they could look, till it finally vanished out of sight. God was there. He has always been and always will be as you look to the future as well. Well, this is an interesting term, this word established in verse 1 and established in verse 2. It's the same word. It just kind of chopped off the first syllable there in the way it was translated. But it's translating the same term, and the term being translated is tikkon in verse 1, and in verse 2, nakon. Now that may not mean anything, but I want to relate it to something that you'll be familiar with. Tikkon in verse 1, nakon in verse 2, it's just different forms of the same verb, meaning to establish something and set it into existence where it is there as a consequence of having been brought into existence, and it abides. I'd like you to look back in 1 Kings, where Solomon built his temple, and he put two big pillars, freestanding pillars. They weren't holding anything up, but they were just large pillars and very, very tall. It says here in the 7th chapter of 1 Kings, verse 21, he set up these pillars in the porch of the temple. He set up the right pillar, which would be the one on the south, and the name of it was Jachin or Yakin. You may catch the significance of the root there with the two words that we pointed out in Psalm 93. Here it's Yakin, which means he will establish. It's the same verb in just different forms. He will establish. And then he set up the other pillar, which was on the north side, called the left, because the way directions were oriented in the Hebrew mind was you were facing east, and so as you face to the east, your south is to your right and the north is to your left. So they called the name of the other pillar Boaz, which is in strength. So if you were approaching the tabernacle from the east and looking towards the west, you would see on your right, you would see Boaz, and on your left, you would see Yakin, which means in strength, he will establish. This was a constant reminder to Israel that God was the one that established the nation. In strength, he established it, and it didn't matter what all the other nations did. They tried to bring David down. They tried to bring down the nation of Israel at different points. But when they called on the Lord, he was able to establish them and hold them in strength. Well, of course, things fell apart, we know, because of unbelief. And if you look over here in the last chapter of 2 Kings, it mentions these pillars. And it's kind of a sad commentary here. 2 Kings chapter 25. It says, verse 16, the two pillars. It's talking about Yakin and Boaz, the two pillars, the one sea, the bases which Solomon had made for the house of the Lord. The brass of all these vessels was without weight. It describes the pillars there again for us. The height of one pillar was 18 cubits, and the chapter upon it was brass. The height of the chapiter, or the headpiece on top of the pillar, was 3 cubits. It was very tall. It was, I believe it was over 30-some feet tall. 34 feet is what sticks in my mind. That's a tall pillar. But at any rate, it mentions both of these pillars, the pillar meaning in strength he will establish. And if you look back up in verse 13, it says, the pillars of brass that were in the house of the Lord, the bases, the brazen sea that was in the house of the Lord, did the Chaldeans break in pieces and carried the brass of them to Babylon. If you'd have been a person not strengthened and informed in your faith, you'd have looked at those pillars, in strength he will establish, and thought, well, God doesn't have any power. Look at that. We've been worshiping a God that doesn't have strength and can't establish, because these two pillars that said in strength he will establish, they're being torn up by the Babylonians, and it's all going to pot. It's all going away. Well, that's because of faith. But if you, unbelief, but if you had faith built in your heart and you listened to what Isaiah said, Jeremiah said, Amos said, and all that, you realized that this had been prophesied by God, and it wasn't that God had lost his strength, is that he was bringing judgment in his strength against an unfaithful covenant community. And so it's interesting, just to mention that, when you go back to Psalm 93, how they could use this same word, kun, which means to establish or bring something into existence. As the consequence, it's there, it exists, and it can't be taken away. It says the world is established and your throne is established. It didn't matter that the pillars were gone. They could see past that natural temple, and they could see there was a God who was still reigning. You and I need to see that today. We have become quite comfortable in our American version of Christianity, and we don't know exactly what the future holds. I hope it's good from a natural standpoint, but we don't know where we are. But one thing we know for sure is that the Lord reigns. And we can identify with these people coming back from the exile who still had a vision of Yahweh, the God who reigns on high. He goes on in the 3rd verse of Psalm 93, the floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. When he talks about the floods, he's talking not only about natural waves and floods of the sea, but that it involves anything that rises up in opposition against God. It could be societies, it could be nations, it could be false ideologies. And in this case, they were able to look back and see the floods. I'd like to just look at that word floods for a moment and consider a few things. Floods can represent the personal things that come against you in your walk with the Lord. Here in Psalm 18, David mentions floods, and he qualifies it with a phrase. It says, the sorrows, this is Psalm 18 and verse 4. Psalm 18 and verse 4, he says, the sorrows of death compassed me, they surrounded me. Psalm 18 and verse 4. The second statement in the verse says, the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. So there can be personal floods that will come against you. And it isn't just people, but if you stop and think that the carnal mind is enmity against God, the carnal mind can rise up with all kinds of thoughts and feelings, and it seems like a flood. It seems like it would be impossible for us to have the victory in righteousness that we need to have, that the scripture promises. And David went through this in terms of natural people who were against him, certainly Saul and all of his henchmen and everything. And we need to keep in mind that ourself is against us as well. Ourself is our own worst enemy, and it can come against us like a flood sometimes. So there's a personal aspect of this. But the greater thing that emerges from Psalm 93 is not, the focus isn't so much on the personal side of it, as it is the universal aspect of these floods. I'd like you to look in Isaiah, the 8th chapter. We touched on it recently, but I just want to point this out. In Isaiah chapter 8, several months back, we mentioned how we're to sanctify the Lord, and that's in this particular chapter. But I'd like to just draw attention to the 8th chapter in verse 7. Now therefore, behold, Isaiah 8:7, the Lord bringeth upon them, this upon the nation of Israel, the waters of the river, strong and many. This flood of waters from the river or the Euphrates. Well, he's not talking about the physical Euphrates River overflowing its banks and reaching hundreds of miles across the desert to Israel. He's using it as a picture of the Assyrian nation. The king of Assyria, all of his glory, he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks. It's describing a flood. He shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck. And with the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel, O God with us. In other words, this was a prophecy that was uttered to let Israel know that judgment was on the horizon. And if people of faith were listening, this became part of their faith. That they trusted in was the word of the Lord. Well, in the 28th chapter of Isaiah, I'd like you to look over there for just a moment, the 28th chapter. Here it's very specific about the judgment that's going to come upon the northern 10 tribes. Capital is Samaria, and the other 10 tribes that rebelled against Rehoboam and so forth back in the earlier years. It says in chapter 28, verse 1, woe to the crown of pride. That's talking about the city of Samaria, the capital of the 10 tribes of the north. Woe to that crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim. Ephraim refers collectively to the 10 tribes of the north, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which is on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. This this beautiful capital city of Samaria, they thought they were impregnable. They thought they were untakeable. And so they were all lifted up, and really their beauty was nothing but a fading flower. It was there, and it was so fragile, like a flower that would lose its vitality because of the judgment God that was going to bring against them. This city was on the head, or a mountain on the top of the fat, fruitful valleys that produced the wine and everything, and he's drawing attention to people who are just living in luxury, and they're drunk on their pride, they're drunk on their prosperity. He says in verse 2, behold, after creating that scene, he says, behold, the Lord has a mighty and a strong one, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim shall be trodden under feet. The glorious beauty which is on the head of the fat valley, that beautiful city of Samaria, shall be a fading flower, and as hasty fruit before the summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth it, while it is yet in his hand, he eats it up. In other words, these invading powers, this flood of enemy powers, is just going to pluck that thing like a piece of fruit off of the tree. I'd like you to look over here. This is prophesying that Israel is going to be judged by Assyria. Now look over to the prophet Nahum for just a moment, the minor prophet Nahum. It might be a little hard to find, and we might get in a big hurry, but it won't hurt to take time to do these things and kind of look at them, because we're interested in building our faith. We're interested in strengthening our confidence in the Lord. And here in Nahum chapter 1, if you'll notice the very first statement, it says the burden of Nineveh. In other words, this is a negative prophecy of judgment, a warning against Nineveh, and it's the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. Now, it says in verse 8, talking about Nineveh, with an overrunning flood, he will make an utter end of the place thereof, and darkness shall pursue his enemies. In other words, God is going to bring a flood against Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria. In other words, the ones that were used to judge Israel, now God is prophesying there's going to be a flood against you. There's going to be destruction against you. Floods rising up. And God using one nation to judge another. He used Nineveh to judge Israel. Now, Nahum is prophesying that Nineveh is going to be judged by Babylon. And this indeed did happen. I believe it was 612 BC that the Babylonians destroyed Nineveh. And so the Assyrians moved a couple hundred miles to the west to the city of Haran. That happens to be the city that Abraham migrated to, if you remember. They moved to that city and set their capital up there. In 610, 2 years later, the Babylonians came and defeated them there. Then they moved their capital about 75, 100 miles further west to the city of Carchemish. And they set their capital up there. The Babylonians followed them there. In other words, there was a flood of Babylon against Nineveh. Now, if you go to Jeremiah, he kind of spells this out in a prophecy for us. Jeremiah chapter 46, I believe, is what we want. Just want us to see something about floods. It's very important. We're just kind of expanding on that business of floods in Psalm 93, I believe it's verse 3, what we were looking at. Here in the 46th chapter of Jeremiah, it says, the word of the Lord which came to Jeremiah the prophet against the Gentiles, or the nations, against Egypt, against the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was by the river Euphrates in Carchemish, which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, smote in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. By this time, the Assyrians were so weak they needed help from the Egyptians. And so, if you'll recall, Egypt came up to help them, and that's when Josiah decided, King Josiah was going to stand against Egypt, and he got killed in that battle and so forth. But the Egyptian army then went on to Carchemish, and they engaged in battle as allies of the Assyrians against the Babylonians, and this resulted in their defeat. Notice what it says in verse 3. It's almost speaking somewhat sarcastically here. Order ye the buckler and the shield, draw near to battle. He's talking to Egypt now. Harness the horses, get up, you horsemen, stand forth with your helmets, furbish the spears, put on the brigandines, or the armor, body armor. Wherefore have I seen them dismayed and turned away back? Their mighty ones are beaten down or fled apace, and look not back, for fear was round about, saith the Lord. Let not the swift flee away, nor the mighty man escape. They shall stumble and fall towards the north by the river Euphrates. He says, who is this that cometh up as a flood, whose waters are moved as the rivers? Egypt rises up like a flood, and his waters are moved like the rivers. He says, I will go up, I will cover the earth, and I will destroy the city and the inhabitants thereof. And then he lets them know, you can read the rest of it here, that they're not going to be successful. I'm just trying to show you how the word floods was used to describe massive moves of nations against each other in hostility and power. Well, if you'll notice here in the 47th chapter, the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet against the Philistines before that Pharaoh smote Gaza. Probably this happened. Pharaoh got defeated by the Babylonians, and he had to return like a dog with his tail tucked between his legs back to Egypt. And on his way, he got a little piece of victory by attacking the Philistines. This is probably where this fits historically. He says, behold, the waters rise up out of the north and shall be an overflowing flood. He's talking about now the Egyptian army coming against the Philistines. And you can read the rest of this at your own leisure, where he describes the battle and the various aspects of the flood metaphorically. So the point of it is that when it talks back in Psalm 93, let's go back there now and tune in where we left off. Psalm 93. This psalmist, we don't know who it was, but he was writing after the exile. He was looking back. He had the advantage now of the historical perspective and looking through the eyes of faith. He says in verse 3, the floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. Past tense, notice, lifted up, past tense twice. And then it says, the floods lift up their voice. They're still doing it. And it's still going on today. Floods of humanity, in various ways, lift up their voice. And we are experiencing that in our own nation now. There are floods lifting up their voice. And they're not all the same. You might think they're all the same, but if you got to analyzing these floods, you're going to find out there's a lot of different tributaries contributing to it, and they all have their own version of self-interest. Nonetheless, there's floods that are rising up, and not only here in our society, but floods rise up around the world. Since these words were uttered by the psalmist some 2,400, 500 years ago, whenever it was, floods have come and gone. They have come and gone, and they will continue to come and go until Jesus returns to this earth and sets everything in proper order. So the floods have lifted up their voice, and they lift up their waves. Waves in the sense of, the Hebrew word carries with it the thought of a wave that hits something and smashes it, breaks it with its power and its force. Now, in contrast to that, it says in verse 4, the Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, yea, than the mighty waves of the sea. What's interesting about this verse is how it's translated. The phrase, the Lord on high is mightier, is at the end of the verse in the Hebrew text, not the beginning. So it would read this way, than the noise of many waters, than the mighty waves of the sea. Waves there means the breakers. You ever heard, been on the ocean or maybe seen a newsreel and it shows these mighty waves hitting